The Indian Ocean did not kiss the coastline of Mombasa. It battered it. The waters off the Kilindini harbor were a deep, churning navy blue, thick with the scent of ancient salt, spilled diesel, and the relentless humidity of the Kenyan coast. This was not the Mombasa of luxury resorts and white sand beaches where foreign tourists sipped cold tamarind juice under the shade of imported palm trees. This was the industrial heart of the continent. It was a world of towering steel cranes that looked like prehistoric iron beasts, lifting shipping containers the size of small houses and dropping them onto the backs of groaning lorries. The air here was never quiet. It was a permanent, vibrating symphony of grinding metal, blasting ship horns, and the shouting of dock workers whose skin was coated in a permanent sheen of sweat and dust. In this world of colossal machines and moving mountains of cargo, human beings were small, but no one was made to feel smaller than Zawadi. Zawadi was 28 years old, though the exhaustion etched into the corners of her dark, steady eyes often made her look older. She was an accountant for Falcon Bridge Capital, the largest logistics and freight investment firm in East Africa. Her mind was a cathedral of numbers, precise and flawless. She could look at a ledger of 10,000 maritime transactions and spot a missing decimal point within seconds. But in the eyes of her regional director, Zawadi's brilliant mind was irrelevant. All that mattered to the director was Zawadi's left leg. When Zawadi was 3 years old, polio had swept through her village in the rural outskirts of the Rift Valley. It had spared her life, but it had taken the strength from her left leg, leaving it permanently weakened. Now, she walked with the aid of a heavy, metal-hinged orthopedic brace strapped to her calf and a wooden cane she gripped with quiet dignity. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and uneven. In a corporate environment that worshipped speed, gloss, and aggressive perfection, Zawadi was treated not as an employee, but as an aesthetic error, a smudge on the polished glass. The midday sun was beating down on the shipping yard, turning the concrete into a frying pan. The heat was a living, breathing entity. It warped the air above the asphalt, making the stacked metal containers shimmer like a mirage. Zawadi stood in the narrow shadow of a rusted red container, holding a clipboard loaded with audit manifests. Sweat trickled down her spine, soaking into the cheap faded cotton of her beige blouse. Her leg throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a reminder of the 2 miles she had walked from the Matatu drop-off point to reach this remote section of the yard. She was here because Eunice, the regional director of Falcon Bridge Capital, had ordered her to manually verify the serial numbers on 50 incoming containers. It was a task meant for a junior yard clerk, a task that required climbing over wooden pallets and squeezing between scorching iron walls. It was not a task for a senior financial auditor, and it was certainly not a task for a woman wearing a heavy metal leg brace. But cruelty, when practiced by someone with absolute power, does not need to make logistical sense. It only needs to inflict pain. Eunice stood a few meters away, untouched by the brutal environment. She was a vision of weaponized elegance. Eunice wore a tailored, cream-colored linen suit that seemed completely resistant to the Mombasa heat. A wide-brimmed designer hat shielded her flawless, expensive makeup from the sun. She held a cold bottle of imported sparkling water in one hand and a gold-plated smartphone in the other. Eunice did not sweat. She merely existed in a state of perpetual, icy superiority. "You are moving like a crippled tortoise, Zawadi." Eunice's voice cut through the heavy, humid air. Her tone was not shouting. It was worse. It was the casual, bored tone of a woman swatting a fly. "I asked for the verification report 20 minutes ago. Do you think international shipping lines pause their schedules because you cannot walk properly?" Zawadi did not look up from her clipboard. She tightened her grip on her wooden cane, shifting her weight to her good leg to relieve the burning pressure in her braced knee. "I am on the final container, Madam Director," Zawadi replied. Her voice was remarkably steady, completely devoid of the tremor Eunice was trying to provoke. "The serial numbers on the manifest do not match the physical stamps on the steel." I am cross-referencing the port entry logs to find the discrepancy. Eunice lowered her smartphone, her eyes narrowing behind oversized, dark sunglasses. She hated that calmness. She hated that no matter how much humiliation she poured over Zawadi's head, the young woman never shattered. Zawadi never cried. She never begged. She just absorbed the cruelty like dry earth absorbing bitter rain, holding it somewhere deep inside where Eunice could not reach. This psychological resilience was not an accident. Zawadi had learned early in life that when the world is designed to crush you, your only defense is an unbreakable mind. Her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after her parents passed, used to tell her, "Tears are a luxury for those who have a safe place to cry. For everyone else, tears are just water wasted." Zawadi did not have a safe place. She had rent to pay in the crowded, corrugated iron slums of Lakoni. She had medical bills for her leg. She needed this job. And because Eunice knew Zawadi needed the job, Eunice owned her, or so she thought. "You are verifying nothing," Eunice snapped, stepping carefully over a patch of spilled oil, her red-soled heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She marched up to Zawadi and snatched the clipboard from her hands. "You are stalling because you are incompetent. Look at you. You are sweating like a common laborer. You are a disgrace to the corporate image of this firm. The discrepancy involves 3 million shillings worth of imported electronics, madam," Zawadi said quietly, keeping her eyes focused on the top button of Eunice's immaculate suit. "If the container is released without a corrected manifest, the firm will be liable for the missing cargo. Do not lecture me on logistics, you pathetic little charity case," Eunice hissed, stepping closer. The scent of Eunice's expensive floral Parisian perfume aggressively overpowered the smell of the port's diesel. "I am the director. I make the decisions. Your only job is to count the numbers I tell you to count, but it seems you are too broken to even do that." Eunice glanced at the massive, open doors of the rusted red container behind Zawadi. Inside, it was completely empty, a hollow cavern of corrugated iron. The temperature inside that metal box was easily 45 degrees Celsius. It was an oven. A dark, malicious idea bloomed in Eunice's mind. It was a cruelty born not of necessity, but of boredom and a desperate need to establish dominance over someone who refused to cower. "You want to verify the inside of the containers so badly?" Eunice said, her lips curving into a venomous smile. "Go in. Check the interior floor for the secondary serial stamp." Zawadi looked at the dark, sweltering belly of the container. "Madam, the secondary stamps are on the exterior roof. There is nothing inside." "Are you refusing a direct order?" Eunice's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Because I can have security escort you off the premises right now. Your employment will be terminated for insubordination. Tell me, Zawadi, how many corporate firms in Nairobi or Mombasa are rushing to hire a limping accountant from the Lakoni slums?" The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Eunice knew exactly what she was doing. This was the anatomy of financial abuse. She was weaponizing Zawadi's poverty, using the threat of starvation to force her into physical submission. It was a power dynamic as old as time, dressed in modern corporate attire. Zawadi closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She thought of the leaking roof in her small apartment. She thought of the upcoming rainy season. She tightened her grip on her cane. Without a word, she turned and dragged her braced leg up the small metal ramp, stepping into the suffocating heat of the container. The moment Zawadi was completely inside, the heavy, rusted iron doors slammed shut behind her. The sound was deafening, a massive metallic boom that echoed in the hollow space. Total darkness descended instantly. Then came the sound of the heavy exterior latch being thrown into place. The padlock clicked closed. "Let us see if the dark helps you find your missing numbers, Zawadi." Eunice's muffled voice came through the thick iron walls. "I am going to lunch with the regional investors at the Tamarind. Do not go anywhere." Outside, Eunice laughed a sharp, crystalline sound and walked away. her heels clicking back toward her waiting air-conditioned Mercedes. Inside the container, Zawadi was trapped in an iron coffin. The heat hit her immediately, pressing against her skin like a physical weight. The air was dead, tasting of rust and old chemical spills. There was no ventilation. Within minutes, the temperature would begin to rise to dangerous levels. Panic, the natural human response to being buried alive, flared in Zawadi's chest. Her breathing quickened. The darkness was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. But Zawadi did not scream. She did not bang her fists against the unyielding metal doors. She knew Eunice would want that. Eunice would want her to lose her dignity, to beg for a mercy that would not come. Instead, Zawadi slowly lowered herself to the floor, her bad legs stretched out stiffly in front of her. She closed her eyes. She began to count in her head. She counted the prime numbers. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. Mathematics was her sanctuary. Numbers were logical. Numbers did not care if you were poor, or if your leg was wrapped in metal, or if you were locked in a shipping container. Numbers were the only truth in a world built on lies. She did not know how long she would be left in the dark. She only knew she would survive it. What Zawadi did not know, and what Eunice in her supreme arrogance had entirely failed to notice, was that they were not alone in this remote section of the shipping yard. Less than 30 meters away, standing in the shadow of a towering stack of wooden pallets, was a janitor. He wore loose, faded blue overalls that were stained with engine grease and dried mud. A battered canvas bucket hat was pulled low over his eyes, shielding his face from the brutal sun. He held a wide industrial broom, sweeping the same patch of asphalt with slow, methodical strokes. To anyone working at the port, this man was entirely invisible. He was part of the background machinery, a mute, deaf laborer who cleaned up the mess left behind by the massive trucks. The foreman ignored him. The drivers yelled past him. His name on the port manifest was simply Juma, a deaf-mute cleaner hired 3 months ago for minimum wage. But beneath the grease and the faded canvas hat, the man was not Juma, and he was certainly not deaf. His real name was Omari, and he was the sole founder and chairman of the board of Falcon Bridge Capital. Omari had not built his empire by sitting in glass towers relying on the filtered reports of middle managers. He had built it in the dirt, starting with a single second-hand cargo truck 20 years ago. When the financial audits from the Mombasa regional office began showing subtle, perfectly hidden anomalies, profits disappearing into operational costs, shadow companies draining fractions of percentages, Omari did not send corporate investigators. Corporate investigators could be bribed. Corporate investigators only saw the paperwork. Omari wanted to see the people. So, the billionaire had stepped out of his penthouse in Nairobi, stripped off his bespoke suits, and put on the overalls of a deaf-mute janitor. For 3 months, he had swept the floors of the Kilindini harbor. He had emptied the trash cans in Eunice's executive office. He had watched, he had listened, and right now, Omari's grip on the wooden handle of his broom was so tight his knuckles were white. He had seen the entire interaction. He had watched his highly paid regional director, a woman entrusted with millions of dollars of corporate assets, lock a disabled employee inside a sweltering metal box simply for the pleasure of inflicting pain. Omari's jaw clenched. The anger that flared inside him was not a hot, explosive rage. It was a cold, absolute zero. It was the kind of anger that toppled empires. He had spent months tracking Eunice's financial crimes, the phantom shell companies she had set up in the Cayman Islands, the altered shipping manifests she used to siphon company funds. He already had enough evidence to send her to a federal prison for 20 years. But seeing this profound, casual cruelty against a woman who had done nothing but try to protect the company's integrity shifted Omari's mission. This was no longer just about recovering stolen money. This was about karmic annihilation. Omari looked at the heavy brass padlock securing the container doors. His first instinct was to walk over, shatter the lock with an iron pipe, and pull Zawadi out of the heat. But his mind, disciplined and strategic, stopped him. If he broke his cover now, Eunice would be alerted. She would have time to wire the stolen offshore funds into untraceable cryptocurrency accounts. She would escape the full weight of the trap he was meticulously building around her. He could not expose himself yet, but he could not leave Zawadi to roast in the dark. Omari moved. He swept his way closer to the red container, dragging his broom along the asphalt. When he was right beside the heavy iron doors, he stopped. He looked around. The yard was empty, the workers having retreated to the shade for their lunch break. Omari stepped up to the metal wall of the container. He raised the heavy wooden handle of his broom and tapped it sharply against the iron. Thud, thud, thud. Inside the suffocating darkness, Zawadi gasped. Her eyes snapped open. The sudden noise startled her out of her mathematical trance. Thud, thud. The tapping came again. It was not the random banging of a machine. It was deliberate. It was a signal. Zawadi pushed herself up on her hands, her breath coming in shallow, hot gasps. She raised her cane and tapped the wooden tip against the metal wall in response. Clack, clack. Outside, Omari heard the response. She was conscious. She was fighting. He reached into the deep pocket of his overalls and pulled out a thick steel tension wrench, a tool he used for fixing the industrial cleaning machines. He jammed the wrench into the mechanism of the heavy brass padlock. He didn't break the lock that would leave evidence. Instead, he forced the internal latch just enough to create a gap, allowing fresh, cooler air to flow through the crack in the doors. It was not freedom, but it was oxygen. It was survival. Omari tapped the wall one last time, a silent promise, before turning and walking away, his head bowed, sweeping the asphalt as if nothing had happened. Inside, Zawadi felt the sudden, blessed rush of air hitting her face. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, the scent of the port filling her lungs. Someone knew she was here. Someone had helped her. She did not know who, but as she sat in the dark, breathing the thin stream of air, her fear vanished, replaced by a quiet, unbreakable resolve. Eunice thought she had locked a victim in the dark. But Zawadi was not a victim. She was the accountant who had been secretly copying Eunice's forged ledgers for 6 months. She was the woman holding the matches, and the dark was exactly where you went when you needed to prepare the fire. The sun did not merely set over the Kilindini harbor, it surrendered. The brutal white glare of the afternoon gave way to a bruised, heavy purple dusk that settled over the Indian Ocean. The massive cargo cranes slowed their relentless mechanical dance, and the shrill whistles of the shift foreman cut through the humid air, signaling the end of the workday. Men with dust-coated faces and exhausted spines began to stream toward the main gates, their boots scraping against the asphalt. It was during this exodus that a junior yard supervisor, tasked with a final perimeter check, walked past the rusted red shipping container. He noticed the heavy brass padlock hanging at an odd angle. Frowning, he reached out and pulled the metal latch. It slid open with a harsh, grating shriek. The heavy iron doors swung wide, groaning on their hinges. Inside, the darkness was absolute, but as the dying light of the evening bled into the cavernous space, a silhouette emerged. Zawadi sat on the grooved metal floor, her braced leg extended straight out, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Her beige cotton blouse was entirely saturated with sweat, clinging to her skin. Her lips were cracked, lined with the dry white salt of severe dehydration. The air that rushed out of the container hit the supervisor like a physical blow. It was stagnant, toxic, and suffocatingly hot. "Mother of God," the supervisor whispered, taking a step back in shock. "What are you doing in there? Who locked this door?" Zawadi did not answer immediately. She could not. Her throat was parched, feeling as though it had been lined with crushed glass. She placed her hands flat against the scorching iron floor and began the arduous process of lifting herself up. Her left knee, encased in its heavy metal and leather brace, screamed in protest after hours of forced immobility. The supervisor instinctively reached out to help her, but Zawadi raised a single, trembling hand, stopping him. There is a specific kind of pride that belongs only to those who have nothing else. It is not the arrogant pride of the wealthy, nor the boastful pride of the strong. It is the quiet, terrifying pride of the broken. To accept the supervisor's hand would be to accept pity, and Zawadi knew that pity was the cousin of defeat. She would walk out of this metal coffin exactly as she had walked into it on her own 2 feet. Her fingers gripped the handle of her wooden cane, her knuckles popped. Slowly, agonizingly, she pulled herself to a standing position. She swayed for a fraction of a second, the blood rushing violently to her head. But she locked her jaw and planted her cane firmly on the floor. "I was conducting an inventory verification," Zawadi said, her voice a dry, raspy whisper that barely carried over the sounds of the port. The wind must have blown the door shut. The supervisor looked at the heavy latch, then at the padlock, knowing full well that the wind does not throw iron bolts and secure brass locks. But he also knew the unwritten laws of the Mombasa port. You did not ask questions that could cost you your livelihood. He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "You need water, sister. Let me take you to the medical tent." "I am fine," Zawadi replied. She stepped out of the container, the evening breeze hitting her face like a cool blessing. She adjusted her skirt, brushed a layer of rust and dust from her blouse, and began the long, uneven walk toward the exit gates. From the shadow of a stacked mountain of wooden pallets, 50 yards away, the janitor watched her. Omari stood perfectly still, his canvas hat pulled low. He watched the agonizing drag of her braced leg, the rigid, unyielding line of her spine, the way she refused to let the pain alter her dignity. He had met prime ministers who did not possess half the command this limping accountant held in her shoulders. The cold, absolute anger inside him crystallized into a vow. Eunice had just sealed her own fate. The trap he was building would not merely catch her, it would obliterate her. The journey back to the Lakoni slums was a daily trial of physical endurance. Zawadi stood in the crushing press of bodies on the Lakoni ferry, the smell of roasted maize, diesel fumes, and unwashed bodies pressing against her from all sides. The ferry engine thrummed beneath her feet, vibrating up through her metal brace and into her aching bones. She stared out at the black water of the channel, the reflection of the city lights dancing on the waves. Why did she endure it? That was the question her neighbors in the slums always asked. "You have an accounting degree, Zawadi. You are brilliant. Why do you let that woman treat you like a stray dog?" The answer was complex, rooted in the psychology of survival. When the world perceives you as weak, it assumes you are also blind. Eunice treated Zawadi as if she were an invisible, disposable object. And because Eunice believed Zawadi was insignificant, Eunice was careless. She left her computer unlocked. She left her encrypted financial drives on her mahogany desk. She spoke to her offshore bankers on the phone while Zawadi was in the room, assuming the crippled girl could not possibly understand international tax evasion laws or routing protocols. Eunice's arrogance was not a weapon. It was a blindfold. And Zawadi was using it to dismantle her empire from the inside. When Zawadi finally reached her small, single-room apartment built from concrete blocks and corrugated iron roofing, it was past 9 at night. The air inside the room was stifling, retaining the heat of the day. She did not turn on the single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. She navigated the small space by the moonlight spilling through the single, barred window. She unbuckled the heavy leather straps of her leg brace, wincing as the metal pulled away from her swollen skin. She washed her face with cold water from a plastic basin, drank 2 full cups of water, and then walked with a pronounced limp toward a small, locked wooden chest pushed under her narrow bed. She opened it. Inside lay a thick, leather-bound ledger and a small, outdated laptop she had bought secondhand in the electronics market. Zawadi opened the laptop and began to type. Her fingers moved across the keys with breathtaking speed and precision. She was not just entering numbers. She was translating the phantom transactions she had memorized from Eunice's desk earlier that week. Millions of Kenyan shillings, routed through dummy logistics companies, funneled into private accounts in the Cayman Islands. Every night, For 6 months, Zawadi had been compiling this shadow ledger. She had bypassed the regional firewall and was transmitting the raw, unedited data directly into a dormant, heavily encrypted sector of the Falcon Bridge Capital Central server in Nairobi. She did not know who was at the top of the corporate ladder. She did not know the mysterious billionaire founder, a man who famously never gave interviews and never showed his face to the regional branches. She only knew that numbers demanded balance. A ledger built on theft was a lie, and Zawadi could not abide a lie. She was sending the truth into the dark, trusting that eventually someone would turn on a light. What she could not possibly know was that the light was already on. The founder was not in Nairobi. He was in Mombasa. He was wearing stained overalls, and he had spent the last 3 hours mentally calculating exactly how he would destroy the woman who had locked Zawadi in that container. The next morning, the Falcon Bridge Capital headquarters rose against the Mombasa skyline like a blade of blue glass. It was a structure designed to intimidate, a monument to corporate wealth. The ground floor lobby was an expanse of polished white marble, imported from Italy, gleaming under the light of massive crystal chandeliers. The air conditioning was set to a sharp, freezing temperature, entirely banishing the tropical heat of the city outside. Zawadi entered through the revolving glass doors at exactly 7:30. She wore a clean, pressed navy blue skirt and a modest white blouse. Her leg brace clicked softly, rhythmically, against the marble floor. In this environment of tailored Armani suits, briefcases that cost more than a year's rent in Likoni, and the aggressive scent of success, Zawadi stood out like a crack in a pristine mirror. She kept her eyes forward, moving toward the employee elevators. But Eunice was already waiting. Eunice stood near the center of the grand lobby, surrounded by 3 junior executives who were hanging on to her every word, like desperate disciples. Eunice wore a striking crimson suit, her lips painted a matching shade of blood red. She held a thick stack of audit files, the very files Zawadi had compiled the night before. When Eunice saw Zawadi walking through the lobby, her conversation stopped. Her eyes narrowed. There is a dangerous psychological shift that occurs in a bully when their victim refuses to break in private. Eunice had expected Zawadi to crawl into the office this morning, weeping, begging for forgiveness, shattered by the trauma of the shipping container. Instead, Zawadi was walking with her chin lifted, her expression as calm and unreadable as deep water. This calmness was an intolerable insult to Eunice's power. If the private torture had failed to break the crippled girl, then public humiliation was required. Eunice needed an audience to validate her superiority. "Zawadi!" Eunice's voice snapped across the vast lobby like a whip. The echoing sound caused several employees to stop in their tracks. The receptionists looked up from their marble desks. The junior executives shifted uncomfortably. Zawadi paused, leaning slightly on her wooden cane. She turned slowly to face her director. "Yes, Madam Director." Eunice walked toward her, the click of her heels sharp and aggressive. "I am reviewing your quarterly summaries," Eunice said loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the silent lobby. "And frankly, I am appalled. You call yourself an accountant? This work is the product of an uneducated mind. It is sloppy, it is riddled with errors. Did you even pass your primary examinations, or did they simply hand you a certificate out of pity?" The cruelty of the words drew gasps from some of the watching employees, though no one dared to speak. Zawadi did not flinch. "The summaries are accurate, madam. They reflect the exact expenditures provided by your office." "Do not talk back to me," Eunice shouted. And then, with a dramatic, sweeping gesture, Eunice raised her hands and released the thick stack of audit files. Hundreds of pages of crisp, white paper exploded into the air, fluttering down like a heavy snowstorm to scatter across the freezing, polished marble floor of the lobby. They spread out over a radius of 10 feet, a chaotic mess of numbers and graphs lying at the feet of the regional director. Eunice crossed her arms, looking down at Zawadi with a smile of pure, venomous triumph. "Pick them up," Eunice commanded softly, but the silence in the lobby made the words deafening. "Pick up every single page, recollate them alphabetically, and I want them on my desk in 20 minutes. If they are not there, you will be fired on the spot." The psychological cruelty of this demand was absolute. To pick up those papers, Zawadi would have to get down on the floor. With her heavy, stiff leg brace, she could not simply crouch. She would have to drop to her hands and knees. She would have to crawl across the polished marble, gathering the papers one by one, like a subservient animal, while the entire corporate staff of the Mombasa branch watched her. It was a systematic, calculated stripping of human dignity. Eunice wanted her to cry. Eunice wanted her to break. The silence in the lobby was suffocating. Every eye was fixed on Zawadi. Zawadi looked at the papers scattered across the floor. She looked at Eunice's triumphant, cruel smile. Then, slowly, with agonizing precision, Zawadi unhooked the locking mechanism on her knee brace. She gripped her wooden cane with both hands, leaning her weight heavily upon it, and began the slow, painful process of lowering herself to the cold marble floor. A collective breath hitched in the throats of the onlookers. It was agonizing to watch. It was a desecration of human pride. But just as Zawadi's right knee touched the freezing marble, the sharp, squeaking sound of rubber wheels broke the silence. From the corridor leading to the service elevators, a yellow mop bucket was pushed into the grand lobby. Behind it was the janitor. He wore the same stained, faded blue overalls, and the battered canvas hat pulled low over his eyes. Omari had seen everything. He had been cleaning the glass doors of the boardroom on the mezzanine level when he heard Eunice's voice. He had watched the papers scatter. He had seen the absolute, sickening arrogance in his regional director's eyes. He pushed his mop bucket directly into the center of the tense circle, placing it squarely between Eunice and the scattered papers. "What are you doing?" Eunice hissed, stepping back as the wet mop brushed dangerously close to her expensive crimson heels. "Get out of here, you filthy mute! This is the executive lobby." Omari ignored her completely. He did not look at Eunice. He did not look at the stunned junior executives. He knelt on the marble floor beside Zawadi. His movements were swift, efficient, and incredibly precise. His large, calloused hands began gathering the scattered documents, scooping them up in massive handfuls, squaring their edges with a sharp tap against the floor. Zawadi looked up, startled. She recognized the faded overalls from the shipping yard the day before. The man's face was shadowed by his hat, but she could see the sharp, hard line of his jaw. He was gathering the papers with a speed she could not match, saving her from having to crawl across the floor. "Leave those alone!" Eunice shrieked, losing her composed, icy veneer. Her voice cracked with genuine rage. "I told her Times, to pick them up! Security! Get this animal out of my lobby!" Two security guards in dark suits immediately unclipped their radios and began rushing toward the center of the room. Omari gathered the last few pages. He stood up in one fluid, powerful motion, holding the perfectly squared stack of audit files. He turned to Zawadi. He reached out, not with pity, but with absolute respect, and offered her his hand. Zawadi hesitated for a fraction of a second. But the hand offered to her was not the hand of a superior looking down. It was the hand of an equal. She reached out and gripped it. His grasp was warm, strong, and unyielding. With a gentle, effortless pull, Omari helped her rise to her feet, steadying her until she had a firm grip on her wooden cane. He handed her the stack of papers. As she took them, their fingers brushed. For the first time, Omari tilted his head back just enough for Zawadi to see his eyes beneath the brim of his canvas hat. They were not the eyes of a subservient laborer. They were the eyes of a king. They burned with an intense, quiet fire, a silent covenant forged in the sterile cold of that marble lobby. "I see you," those eyes said. "Hold on." Before the security guards could reach them, Omari turned his back on Eunice, grabbed the handle of his mop bucket, and wheeled it away, disappearing down the service corridor as silently as a ghost. Eunice was shaking with rage. Her pristine public humiliation had been derailed by a man who scrubbed toilets for a living. She glared at Zawadi, her chest heaving. "Bring those to my office," Eunice spat, the words dripping with venom. "Now." She turned and stormed toward the private elevators, the junior executives scurrying after her like frightened mice. The crowd in the lobby began to disperse, the murmurs starting immediately. Zawadi stood alone in the center of the vast, gleaming floor. She held the heavy stack of papers against her chest. She did not feel humiliated. She did not feel broken. She felt a strange electric pulse vibrating through her fingertips where the janitor's hand had touched hers. For the first time in 3 years of enduring Eunice's psychological warfare, Zawadi felt something entirely new. She felt hope. Upstairs, in the suffocating luxury of the executive suite, the clock began to tick toward the annual Shareholder Summit. The trap was no longer just a blueprint. The steel jaws were open, the bait was set, and Eunice, blinded by her own unassailable arrogance, was walking directly toward the teeth. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was a slow, pressurized ascent into the stratosphere of corporate power. Zawadi leaned against the brushed steel wall of the cabin, her eyes closed. The heavy stack of collated audit files rested securely in the crook of her arm. Beneath the stiff leather and metal of her orthopedic brace, her left knee was swelling, the joint radiating a deep, burning heat that threatened to turn her legs to water. She focused on the low, electronic hum of the elevator motor. She regulated her breathing, pushing the physical pain into a locked compartment in her mind. This was a survival technique she had mastered over decades. Pain was merely a biological signal. It did not dictate her actions unless she allowed it to. When the polished steel doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The executive floor smelled of ozone, fresh orchids, and the faint, bitter tang of espresso. The carpets were thick, sound-absorbing wool, designed to silence the footsteps of anyone approaching the inner sanctum. Zawadi made her way toward the corner office. The heavy mahogany door was slightly ajar. Inside, Eunice was pacing. The regional director had shed her suit jacket, revealing a silk blouse that clung slightly to her skin with the perspiration of raw, unfiltered rage. Her flawless composure from the lobby had shattered. She was muttering into her gold-plated smartphone, her voice tight and frantic, directing her offshore bankers to expedite a series of transfers. There is a specific psychological autopsy required to understand a woman like Eunice. She was not born into wealth. She had clawed her way out of a middle-class Nairobi suburb by weaponizing her charm, her ruthlessness, and her uncanny ability to steal the credit for the brilliance of those beneath her. But the tragedy of the imposter is that they never stop hearing the footsteps of the truth. Eunice knew she was mathematically illiterate compared to the quiet, limping woman she employed. Every time Zawadi handed her a perfectly balanced, immensely complex financial model, it was a silent mirror reflecting Eunice's own mediocrity. Eunice did not hate Zawadi because Zawadi was disabled or poor. Eunice hated Zawadi because Zawadi was genuinely, effortlessly brilliant. Destroying Zawadi's dignity was the only way Eunice could maintain the illusion of her own superiority. Zawadi tapped her wooden cane against the doorframe. Eunice spun around, ending her call abruptly. Her chest heaved. She looked at the stack of perfectly organized files in Zawadi's arms, and then her eyes darted to the door, half expecting the mute janitor to be standing there as well. "Put them on the desk," Eunice snapped, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window to put distance between them. Zawadi crossed the room, the soft thud of her cane sinking into the wool carpet. She placed the files precisely on the center of the mahogany desk. "The collation is complete, Madam Director. The final slide deck for tomorrow's Shareholder Summit is ready for your review." Eunice did not turn around. She stared out at the Indian Ocean, watching the tiny, distant shapes of the cargo ships. "You are not to attend the summit tomorrow, Zawadi. I am the lead auditor for this quarter," Zawadi replied smoothly. "Corporate protocol dictates that the compiling accountant must be present to verify any anomalies raised by the board." "I dictate the protocol in this building," Eunice shouted, finally turning, her eyes blazing. "You think because some filthy, uneducated laborer picked up your papers in the lobby, you have suddenly acquired status? You are nothing. You are a ghost. You will take your laptop, and you will go down to the sub-basement archives. You will spend the entirety of tomorrow cross-referencing the 3-year physical receipt backlog. You will not see the sun. You will not speak to anyone, and when the summit is over, and my promotion to the Nairobi Executive Board is confirmed, I will personally oversee your termination." Eunice smiled, a brittle, ugly expression. "You are obsolete, Zawadi. The corporate world does not reward martyrs, it buries them." The words were designed to obliterate hope. They were designed to send Zawadi into the dark sub-basement, a broken, weeping shell. But as Zawadi looked at Eunice's flushed face and trembling hands, she felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical pity. Eunice had just ordered the architect of her destruction into the exact room where the detonator was housed. "I understand, Madam Director," Zawadi said softly. She bowed her head slightly, turned, and limped out of the office. The sub-basement of the Falcon Bridge Capitol building was a windowless, concrete bunker 3 levels below the bustling streets of Mombasa. The central air conditioning did not reach this deep into the earth. The air was stagnant, smelling of decaying cardboard, printer ink, and the metallic tang of overheated server racks. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly, flickering yellow glow over rows of gray metal filing cabinets. Zawadi sat at a small, battered metal desk tucked in the far corner. It was past 9 at night. The building above her was empty, save for the nocturnal security patrols. Her laptop screen was the only steady source of light. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She was not cross-referencing receipts. She was writing the final lines of a dormant macro code. For 6 months, Zawadi had been tracking the millions of shillings Eunice was siphoning into the Cayman Islands. But gathering the evidence was not enough. In the corporate world, evidence handed to human resources often disappeared. Investigations were quietly smothered to protect the company's stock price. Whistleblowers were paid off, or worse, discredited and destroyed. If Zawadi simply emailed the offshore ledgers to the board, Eunice would claim Zawadi had fabricated them out of spite for being fired. Eunice had the power, Zawadi had none. So, Zawadi had chosen a different method. A public execution. She had embedded a sleeper virus inside the master PowerPoint presentation Eunice would use the next morning. It was a beautiful piece of digital architecture. When Eunice clicked the remote to transition to slide 4, the slide detailing the record-breaking offshore profit margins, the macro would awaken. It would instantly bypass the visual interface, override the boardroom projector, and pull the live, encrypted transaction logs directly from the central server. It would display the exact routing numbers, the timestamps, and Eunice's digital authorization signatures for every stolen shilling. It could not be turned off. It could not be paused. It was the truth, unchained. Zawadi pressed the enter key. The screen flashed green. Macro embedded. Execution sequence locked. She leaned back in the cheap plastic chair, closing her eyes. The exhaustion hit her then, a massive, crushing wave that made her bones ache. She had not eaten since breakfast. Her leg was throbbing so fiercely she felt nauseous. She rubbed her temples, wondering if she had the strength to make the long walk to the ferry in the dark. A soft squeak broke the heavy silence of the basement. Zawadi's eyes snapped open. The heavy fire door at the end of the archive aisle was propped open. A yellow mop bucket sat in the threshold, and walking down the narrow aisle between the towering shelves of cardboard boxes was the janitor. Omari moved without a sound, his rubber-soled boots silent on the concrete floor. He carried a small black trash bag. He wore the same faded overalls, but the canvas hat was pushed back slightly, revealing a face carved from granite. Strong, angular features, a jaw lined with a faint shadow of stubble, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He stopped at the edge of Zawadi's metal desk. Zawadi looked up at him. She did not feel fear. There was a quiet, immense gravity to this man that displaced the stale air of the basement. He did not look like a cleaner. He looked like a mountain that had temporarily decided to wear clothes. "The buses stop running at midnight," Zawadi said quietly, repeating the mundane warning out of sheer habit. Omari did not reply. He looked at the glowing screen of her laptop. He looked at the heavy metal brace strapped to her swollen leg. He looked at the dark circles of absolute exhaustion under her eyes. For a moment, the mask of the mute janitor slipped entirely, and a profound, fierce respect flared in his dark eyes. He reached into the deep pocket of his overalls. He withdrew a thick, sealed envelope. The paper was heavy linen, a crisp, blinding white that looked entirely alien in the grim dirt of the basement. He placed it gently onto the metal desk, right beside her keyboard. Without a single word, Omari turned and walked back up the aisle. He picked up his mop bucket, stepped through the fire door, and let it close behind him. Zawadi sat perfectly still for a long time. The only sound was the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. Slowly, her trembling fingers reached out and picked up the envelope. There was no name on the front, no corporate logo. She slid her thumb under the wax seal and broke it. Inside was a single sheet of matching linen paper. She unfolded it. The text was not printed by a machine. It was handwritten in thick, bold, black fountain pen ink. "The presentation will be given exactly as you have designed it. The architect should always be present to watch the building fall. I have reserved a seat for you at the back of the room." Zawadi's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her mind, analytical and sharp, raced through the impossibilities. No one in the regional office knew about the macro. No one knew she was altering the presentation, except the encrypted data packets she had been sending to the central server in Nairobi. She had assumed they were sitting in a dormant file, waiting for a low-level auditor to eventually flag them. She looked at the elegant, powerful handwriting. She looked at the closed fire door where the janitor had just exited. The pieces slammed together with terrifying clarity. The mute laborer who had defied Eunice in the lobby. The man who had somehow unlocked the shipping container without breaking the padlock. The man who handed her premium linen stationery in a sub-basement at 10 o'clock at night. She was not alone. The unseen founder of Falcon Bridge Capital was not in Nairobi. He was here, and he had been watching her. A single tear, hot and unbidden, slipped down Zawadi's cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, or pain, or fear. It was the overwhelming, shattering relief of being time seen. For 3 years, she had been a ghost, a punching bag, a crippled girl to be mocked and discarded. But the king of the empire had been standing in the shadows, watching her hold up the pillars of his company with her bare, bruised hands. Zawadi carefully folded the letter and placed it inside her blouse, directly over her heart. She shut down her laptop. Her legs still ached, and her stomach still cramped with hunger, but as she stood up and grasped her wooden cane, she felt lighter than she had in years. The long war was over. Tomorrow was the execution. The morning of the annual Shareholder Summit arrived, draped in violence. A massive coastal storm had rolled in from the Indian Ocean overnight. Thunder rattled the reinforced glass windows of the Falcon Bridge headquarters, and torrential rain washed the streets of Mombasa in a gray, blinding deluge. Inside the 42nd floor Grand Conference Hall, however, the climate was perfect. The room was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. The walls were paneled in rich, dark mahogany. At the center of the room sat a massive oval table, polished to a mirror finish, surrounded by 24 high-backed leather chairs. At the far end of the room, a gargantuan digital screen displayed the Falcon Bridge Capital logo, a golden hawk in flight. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted Arabica coffee, expensive colognes, and the subtle electric tension of extreme wealth. By 9:30, the room was full. Executives who had flown in from Nairobi, Johannesburg, and London sat around the oval table. The corporate attorney, a silver-haired man named Mr. Hastings, who charged $500 an hour, sat near the front, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. Behind them, in tiered gallery seating, sat the major regional shareholders, whispering amongst themselves, reviewing printed portfolios. Eunice stood at the head of the table. She was a vision of absolute, untouchable power. She wore a tailored, stark, white suit that contrasted sharply with the dark wood of the room. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She held a sleek, black remote control in her right hand. She looked at the executives, her smile radiant and confident. She was standing at the apex of her life. She was minutes away from securing her seat on the global executive board. In the very back corner of the room, standing in the shadows near the silver catering urns, was Zawadi. She wore a simple faded gray skirt and her usual white blouse. Her wooden cane rested against the wall. She stood perfectly still, making herself as small and invisible as possible. Eunice had not noticed her slip into the room. If Eunice had, she would have had security drag her out immediately. But Zawadi had the written permission of the chairman resting against her heart. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. At exactly 9:45, Eunice tapped the microphone on the podium. The low hum of elite conversation died away instantly. The only sound was the distant, muffled crash of thunder against the glass tower. Distinguished executives, esteemed shareholders, and honored guests, Eunice began, her voice modulated to a perfect pitch of professional warmth. Welcome to the Mombasa Regional Summit. This morning, I do not just bring you numbers. I bring you proof of a revolution in our logistics pipeline. The executives leaned forward, their pens poised over legal pads. Eunice pressed the button on her remote. The screen behind her shifted, displaying a beautifully animated graphic of cargo ships moving across a digital map of East Africa. Over the past 12 months, Eunice continued, pacing slowly across the front of the room, the Mombasa division has faced unprecedented challenges. Supply chain disruptions, port tariffs, and volatile fuel markets. Yet, despite these headwinds, we have not merely survived, we have dominated. She pressed the remote again. A bar graph appeared, showing a massive, exponential spike in quarterly profits. Murmurs of approval rippled through the tiered seating. Mr. Hastings, the corporate attorney, nodded slowly. Eunice smiled, letting the applause wash over her. It was the drug she had craved her entire life. Validation, supremacy. By streamlining our offshore asset management, Eunice said, her voice rising with triumphant energy, and by eliminating redundant operational costs, including the termination of underperforming, obsolete personnel, we have secured a profit margin that outpaces every other division on this continent. She turned to face the massive screen, raising the remote like a conductor raising a baton for the final crescendo. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the future of Falconbridge Capital. Eunice pressed the button for slide 4. Click. The macro awoke. The beautiful, upward trending bar graph vanished. The screen went entirely black for one agonizing second. Then, lines of raw, glowing white text began to scroll violently down the massive digital display. It looked like the code of a mainframe system bleeding out onto the screen. Account routing. 448992 Cayman Islands. Funds diverted. 45 million KES. Authorization signature. Eunice Kiplagat. Timestamp. 4/12/2023 14 Ghost Company Registry. Apex Logistics, Ltd. The text scrolled endlessly, line after line after line, detailing every single stolen shilling, every forged signature, every phantom truck, every shadow account. It was the complete, undeniable autopsy of a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. Eunice stopped breathing. Her hand, still raised in the air holding the remote, froze. The smile on her face did not vanish. It simply petrified, turning into a grotesque, frozen grimace. She stabbed the button on the remote again. Click, click, click. The screen ignored her. The numbers kept scrolling. Faster now, a digital avalanche of truth burying her alive. The silence that fell over the grand conference hall was absolute. It was not the polite, awkward silence of technical difficulties. It was the heavy, terrifying silence of a room full of apex predators who suddenly realize there is blood in the water. At the center of the oval table, the regional vice president slowly lowered his coffee cup. It rattled against the porcelain saucer. Mr. Hastings, the attorney, pushed his gold-rimmed glasses up his nose, his eyes locked on the Cayman Islands routing numbers. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pen, and quietly crossed Eunice's name off the top of his legal pad. Eunice's sister, who had been sitting in the front row of the shareholder gallery as a consultant, suddenly stood up. She did not say a word. She simply picked up her designer handbag, turned, and walked out of the room. She knew a sinking ship when she saw one. Panic, raw and animalistic, finally broke through Eunice's paralysis. She slammed her hand against the podium keyboard, frantically hitting the escape key, the power button, anything. The screen remained locked. The numbers continued to scroll, reflecting their harsh white light across her pristine white suit. She spun around, her eyes wide, searching the room for a target, a scapegoat, anything to save her. Her gaze swept over the stunned executives, the silent shareholders, and finally landed on the dark corner near the catering urns. She saw Zawadi. Zawadi stood perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on the head of her wooden cane. Her face was a mask of absolute, serene indifference. "You!" Eunice shrieked. The sound was horrifying, a high-pitched, desperate scream that shattered the professional decorum of the room. The executives flinched. "Turn it off! Turn it off right now, you crippled witch!" Eunice abandoned the podium, storming down the length of the mahogany table, her heels hammering against the wood floor. She pointed a trembling, manic finger at Zawadi. "Security!" Eunice screamed, spit flying from her lips. "Arrest her! She is a disgruntled employee. She hacked the system. She is trying to frame me because I fired her." Zawadi did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at Eunice with the calm, terrifying pity of a doctor looking at a terminal patient. "I did not frame you, Eunice," Zawadi said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the echoes of Eunice's screams. "I simply balanced the ledger. Numbers cannot lie." "I will kill you," Eunice hissed, lunging forward, her hands curling into claws. Before Eunice could close the distance, the heavy, double-oak doors at the main entrance of the conference hall swung open with a resounding Times crash. The heavy, double-oak doors at the main entrance of the conference hall did not merely open. They were thrown back with such violent force that the brass handles gouged into the mahogany paneling of the walls. The resounding crash echoed like a thunderclap, momentarily drowning out the actual storm raging against the glass tower outside. Every executive in the room flinched. Eunice stopped mid-lunge, her manicured hands frozen in the air, her chest heaving as she spun toward the entrance. She expected to see her security detail, armed and ready to drag Zawadi out of the building. Instead, standing in the threshold, bringing the smell of rain, diesel oil, and raw earth into the pristine, climate-controlled sanctuary of the boardroom, was the janitor. He pushed his battered yellow mop bucket over the metal threshold. The rubber wheels let out a high-pitched, agonizing squeak that sliced through the absolute silence of the room. He was wearing the exact same oil-stained blue overalls he had worn in the shipping yard. His heavy rubber boots left thick, dark tracks of mud and rainwater across the immaculate, hand-woven Persian rug. The canvas bucket hat was pulled low over his brow, dripping water onto the floor. Eunice stared at him, her mind completely fracturing. The sheer absurdity of a manual laborer walking into an executive shareholder summit simply did not compute in her hyper-elitist worldview. "Get out!" Eunice shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical register. "How did you get up here? Where is the security team? I want this filthy mute thrown down the stairwell. I want him arrested." The janitor did not stop. He walked with slow, deliberate, heavy steps, pushing his mop bucket straight down the center of the room, parallel to the massive oval table where the international executives sat frozen in shock. He left a trail of dirty water in his wake, a deliberate desecration of Eunice's perfect empire. He stopped when he reached the front of the room, standing directly between Eunice and the massive digital screen that was still frantically scrolling her financial crimes. He let go of the mop handle. He reached up with large, calloused hands and pulled the canvas hat from his head, dropping it carelessly onto the polished mahogany table. He raised his head, looking directly into Eunice's wild, bloodshot eyes. The corporate attorney, Mr. Hastings, a man who had spent 40 years building a reputation on being entirely unshakable, made a sound that was half gasp, half choke. He stood up so fast that his heavy leather chair tipped over backward and crashed into the tier of seating behind him. Hastings ignored it. He fumbled with the center button of his tailored suit jacket, his hands trembling so violently he could barely secure the fabric. Mr. Hastings bowed at the waist, his silver head dipping low in an angle of absolute submission. "Mr. Chairman," the attorney whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound terror and awe, "we did not expect you to arrive from Nairobi in person." The words fell into the room like anvils dropped from a great height. "Mr. Chairman," the shockwave hit the oval table. One by one, the visiting executives from London, Johannesburg, and Lagos realized what they were looking at. They realized that the broad shoulders, the sharp, angular jawline, and the terrifyingly cold, intelligent eyes belonged to the ghost of East African commerce. This was Omari, the billionaire founder of Falcon Bridge Capital, the man who owned the building, the port, the ships, and their entire careers. And he was wearing garbage. The psychological collapse of Eunice Kiplagat was not a slow decline. It was a catastrophic structural failure. The blood drained from her face so completely that her skin took on the color of wet ash. Her knees buckled slightly, her expensive white heels wobbling on the carpet. The heat of her rage was instantly extinguished by a paralyzing, icy terror. She looked at the muddy boots. She looked at the stained overalls, and then she remembered the man sweeping the asphalt outside the rusted shipping container. She remembered the man picking up the scattered papers in the lobby while she called him an animal. She had not just insulted her boss. She had tortured his employees in front of him. She had shown the king the absolute blackness of her soul, thinking she was standing in the dark. "You," Eunice gasped, the word barely squeezing past the constriction in her throat. Her mind desperately tried to assemble a lie, an excuse, a defense, but there was nothing. The scrolling numbers on the screen behind him were absolute. Omari did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When you own the earth beneath people's feet, you do not need to shout to make them tremble. "Security will not be saving you today, Eunice," Omari said. His voice was deep, resonant, and completely devoid of the muteness he had feigned for 3 months. It possessed a gravitational pull that commanded the entire room. "I dismissed the floor guards 10 minutes ago. The only people waiting outside those doors are 3 detectives from the Anti-Corruption Commission." Eunice swayed, grabbing the edge of the wooden podium to keep from collapsing. "No," she whimpered. "No, please. Sir, I can explain the discrepancies. The market was volatile. I was protecting the regional assets." "Do not insult my intelligence," Omari cut her off, his tone glacial. "For 3 months, I have swept the floors of your division. I have cleaned the glass of your office while you screamed at your subordinates. I have emptied your trash while you negotiated bribes on your phone. I have smelled the diesel of the cargo yards, and I have watched you steal 45 million shillings from the foundation of this company." Omari took a slow step toward her. Eunice shrank back, pressing herself against the digital screen. "But the theft of my money is not what disgusts me," Omari continued, his eyes narrowing, the cold anger finally breaking through his composed surface. Money is just paper. What disgusts me is your profound lack of humanity. You built an empire on arrogance. You believed that because people were quiet, they were blind. You believed that because people were poor, they were stupid. You believed that because a woman wore a metal brace on her leg, she was weak. Omari turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the terrified executives at the table, ensuring that every single one of them understood the new law of his company. You locked an innocent woman in a shipping container under the midday sun to hide your own incompetence, Omari's voice echoed off the mahogany walls. You stripped her of her dignity in my lobby. You mistook kindness for weakness, and you mistook your temporary authority for absolute power. Eunice was openly weeping now, tears ruining her flawless makeup, leaving dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. She slid down the side of the podium, falling to her knees on the floor. The pristine white fabric of her suit soaked up the muddy water Omari had tracked in. She did not care. She clasped her hands together in a gesture of pathetic desperation. "Please, Mr. Chairman," Eunice begged, her voice a ragged sob. "I will give it all back. I will resign. Just let me walk away. Do not send me to prison. I have a family. I have a reputation." "Your reputation," Omari said softly, looking down at her, "is exactly what you have earned. Nothing more, nothing less." Omari raised his hand and snapped his fingers. The heavy oak doors opened again. This time, it was not the janitor. It was a team of plainclothes detectives from the Economic Crimes Unit, accompanied by 2 uniformed police officers holding heavy steel handcuffs. They moved into the room with grim efficiency. Eunice screamed as the officers grabbed her by the arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. She kicked, she thrashed, she begged the other executives for help, but the men at the table simply looked away, terrified of catching the chairman's eye. The removal was swift, violent, and utterly devoid of the corporate dignity Eunice had worshipped her entire life. As she was dragged out into the corridor, her frantic shrieks echoed down the hall, growing fainter and fainter until the elevator doors closed, cutting off the sound entirely. The grand conference hall was deathly silent. Omari stood at the front of the room, the muddy yellow mop bucket beside him. He looked at the executives. "By midnight tonight, every single department in the Mombasa branch will undergo a full forensic audit," Omari announced, his voice returning to its calm, terrifying baseline. "If any of you knew about the Cayman accounts and remained silent, you will be joining Eunice. If you did not know, you are incompetent, and you will be replaced." Meeting adjourned. The executives scrambled to pack their briefcases. They moved with a panicked, frantic energy, desperate to escape the room before the chairman's gaze fell upon them. Within 2 minutes, the massive oval table was completely empty, save for the overturned leather chair. Omari did not leave. He stood in the quiet room, the scrolling numbers on the screen finally coming to a halt, leaving the Falcon Bridge logo glowing softly in the dim light. He turned his body slowly, looking past the mahogany table, past the silver catering urns, toward the deep shadows of the back corner. Zawadi was still standing there. She had not moved an inch. Her hands were resting on her wooden cane. Her face was completely dry, her expression peaceful. The storm that had just ripped through the room had not touched her, because she was the one who had written the weather. "Miss Zawadi," Omari called out, his voice losing its sharp corporate edge, softening into something deeply human. Zawadi stepped forward, moving out of the shadows. Her limp was pronounced, the heavy metal brace clicking rhythmically against the floor. "Yes, Mr. Chairman." Omari gestured to the massive, high-backed leather chair at the very head of the oval table, the seat of absolute power. The chair Eunice had spent her entire life trying to claim. "Please sit down, Stokelace," Omari said. "We have a regional director position to fill." and I require someone who understands the value of a clean ledger, someone who knows that numbers cannot lie." Zawadi looked at the empty chair. She looked at the billionaire in the stained overalls. She understood the magnitude of what was happening. This was not a reward for her suffering. This was an acknowledgement of her genius. Omari was not giving her a charity handout. He was handing his empire over to the most capable mind in the building. Zawadi walked forward. She did not try to hide her limp. She did not try to walk faster to impress him. She moved with the slow, deliberate dignity of a woman who had carried the weight of the world and refused to break. She reached the head of the table. She turned, placing her wooden cane carefully against the edge of the mahogany wood. She lowered herself into the heavy leather chair. It was comfortable. It felt right. She opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her face in the dim room. She did not smile. She simply looked at Omari and nodded. "Let us begin the audit," she said. "Time is the ultimate equalizer. It strips away the illusions of power and reveals the bare, undeniable architecture of character." 6 months after the thunderstorm that shattered the old regime, the Mombasa branch of Falcon Bridge Capital was unrecognizable. The polished marble lobby was the same, the glass tower still pierced the sky, but the air inside breathed differently. Zawadi sat in the corner executive office on the 42nd floor. The room no longer smelled of expensive, oppressive perfume. It smelled of fresh coastal air, the large windows thrown open to let the breeze from the Indian Ocean circulate. There were no terrified junior executives scurrying in the halls. There was order, efficiency, and a profound, quiet respect. Zawadi had implemented changes that baffled the traditional corporate mind, but skyrocketed the division's productivity. She mandated mandatory heat breaks for the dock workers. She ordered the installation of massive industrial fans in the cargo yards. She paid the overtime wages that Eunice had stolen for years. She treated the laborers not as machinery, but as the blood pumping through the veins of the company. And in return, the port operated with a flawless, fiercely loyal precision. Losses dropped to zero. Profits, real, honest profits, soared. She still wore her simple cotton blouses. She still walked with her wooden cane. But when she moved through the shipping yards now, the foremen did not look away. They tipped their hats. The dock workers parted to let her pass. They called her the Iron Accountant. They knew she had survived the fire, and they knew she would never let them burn. Far below the glass tower, down by the Laconia ferry terminal where the smell of diesel and rotting fish choked the air, the afternoon sun was beating down without mercy. The terminal was crowded, a chaotic mass of thousands of people pushing toward the rusty ferries. At the edge of the boarding ramp, a woman in a faded, ill-fitting orange reflective vest was pushing a heavy industrial broom across the concrete. The woman was thin, her face drawn and hollow. Her hair, once styled with expensive precision, was tied back in a messy, sweat-soaked knot. Her skin was peeling from the brutal exposure to the coastal sun. She moved slowly, her shoulders slumped with a heavy, permanent exhaustion. It was Eunice. The Cayman accounts had been seized. The corporate lawsuits had stripped her of every asset she owned, her house, her cars, her designer clothes. The criminal courts had offered her a choice between a lengthy prison sentence or a suspended sentence with mandated, highly supervised community labor to pay back the civil damages. She had chosen the labor, hoping she could rebuild. But when your only skill is manipulating others, hard labor destroys you. Eunice paused her sweeping, leaning heavily against the wooden handle of her broom to catch her breath. Her hands were covered in blisters. Her feet ached inside cheap rubber boots. A sleek, black corporate convoy rolled slowly down the VIP lane toward the ferry terminal, bypassing the massive crowd. The vehicles were armored, polished to a mirror shine. Eunice looked up as the convoy passed. In the back seat of the lead vehicle, the tinted window was rolled halfway down to let in the sea breeze. Eunice saw the profile of the woman sitting inside. She saw the calm, steady eyes. She saw the simple wooden cane resting against the leather seat. It was Zawadi. For one brief, agonizing second, the convoy slowed due to the foot traffic, and Zawadi turned her head. Her eyes met Eunice's through the gap in the window. Zawadi did not sneer. She did not smile. She did not offer a look of triumph or a gaze of pity. She simply looked at Eunice with the complete, utter indifference one gives to a ghost. Zawadi had moved on. Eunice was nothing more than a memory of a storm that had long since passed. The convoy accelerated, rolling onto the ferry, leaving Eunice behind in the dust and the heat. Eunice stared after the vehicles until they disappeared. A profound, crushing emptiness settled over her. She looked down at her blistered hands. She looked at the heavy wooden broom. And for the first time in her life, Eunice understood the truth. She had not been destroyed by a macro code. She had not been destroyed by an undercover billionaire. She had been destroyed by her own hands. Pride is a predator. It feeds on your soul, convinces you that you are untouchable, and then leaves you empty when the world finally demands the truth. Eunice lowered her head, gripped the broom, and went back to sweeping the dirt. Life does not reward cruelty. It merely records it in a ledger, waiting for the day the balance must be paid. And true power is never found in the ability to break someone. True power is found in the quiet, unyielding strength of those who refuse to stay broken. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that their quiet endurance is not a weakness. Share it with the woman who does the work while others take the credit. Because the truth is always being recorded, and justice, no matter how delayed, never forgets an address. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in the power of patience, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from today. Stay strong, stay grounded, and remember that the darkest nights only exist to prepare you for the dawn.